Hey Serge, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Today we're going to be covering a pretty exciting topic. I definitely think you're the man to talk to. Titled it Bigger, Better, Faster. And really it's about tech in New Zealand. It's growing super fast. And today I want to just cover, can the sector keep up with that growth? Some of these are your stats, so correct me if I'm wrong, that you'll see glittered through here, but tech is going to roughly 4x over the next 10 to 12 years. And behind us right now are several years of consistent growth in the sector. We've got, a bunch of successful exits, experienced founders that are re-entering the ecosystem with new startups. And ahead of us, though, lies things like AI, rocket ships, and further international expansion required by the SaaS companies in New Zealand at another level than we've seen before. Today, I really want to talk about what do we need to be prepared, what should we be afraid of, and that is why, Serge, I've invited you, a tech and SaaS veteran, to list off some of your current experience: angel investor, board member, operating partner at Movac, advisor at NZTE, advisory council member at KiwiSaaS, and previously CMO at Fiserv before a successful exit. It's obviously quite the laundry list of experience, and I've actually shortened it considerably.
Cool, let's do it.
Yeah, let's go. So truthfully, I'm not really sure that we're set up right now to deliver on the growth, the projected growth that we have in the tech sector. We need companies, we need people, and we need investment, and most of all, we need founders. Where do they all come from? I don't quite know. There's a great community already here. We've got some great organizations adding into the ecosystem, but the concept of 4xing something, it's already been growing fairly considerably, is obviously still a big ask, and I think there's a lot of work to do behind the scenes. I would add that I'm an optimist. I do think we'll solve these problems, and I'm hoping to get some insights to the solutions to those problems from you today. So first question, Serge, you may very well be the best known man in tech. What is your secret?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm the best known man in tech, but I am relatively well known. I guess if I don't really have a secret, the secret to most success is a bit of hard work. So me personally, I'm privileged that I spend about 500 hours a year helping other people with no direct benefit to myself. So I get around, have a lot of free cups of coffee and cake. That's one part of it. Second thing is I try and scale myself, and I do that through events and online things and all of that stuff. So again, just gives me exposure. And then on the back of that, LinkedIn's decided that I'm an influencer. So everything I post on that platform happens to get amplified, which happens to reach a lot of people, especially people who I know. So those things combined give me a little bit of influence, and I try and use it for the good.
Yeah, and you certainly have been. You've got a long list of companies, as you've said, that you've helped and also invested in that are doing fantastically, and no doubt in part thanks to your advice as well. Aside from all the free coffee and cake, what have the three highlights of your career so far been within the tech space?
Oh, career's been long. You used the word veteran, which was a polite way of saying old person. I sort of think if I had to go off the cuff, my three highlights, I think the first one was getting into the IT sector. So New Zealand Post took a punt on an HR professional who pretended to know a bit about tech and was definitely interested in it. And they hired me to become a program manager delivering software ERP projects. So that's a highlight because it got me into the sector. Most people get into the sector by accident, I think, even today, let alone sort of 20-something years ago. I think my first failed startup, which was a company doing online medical records, was a highlight because it actually, even though we failed, it actually amplified my value to the market. And so not only was the cost of failure almost negligible to me, but it actually created a whole lot of opportunities and things that I learned. So failure is the best teacher. In fact, it's probably the only teacher. So I'm grateful for that. And then, of course, going on the MCom journey with my colleagues, Adam, Graham, Ed, and Matt, and taking that business global when there wasn't a blueprint for taking a B2B software company into the US and winning a category. And that was a pretty exciting ride, both pre and post acquisition by Fiserv.
Nice. I can imagine those are all great highlights, and no doubt you've got many more. It's interesting you touching on the blueprint component when you did it compared to now, what do you think has changed in regards to that blueprint?
Well, firstly, when we tried to raise money at MCom, there wasn't any. There wasn't a venture capital scene whatsoever. So we had to bootstrap it, and that created constraints when the market grew. So we're a mobile banking business, and at some point the iPhone came out, and everyone could see the future, which we'd seen sort of 5 years earlier. So it kind of cramped our growth opportunities. So the venture capital scene is very, very different. New Zealand has a reputation for creating great software companies, and I'm very focused on B2B cloud software, or SaaS, as you know. So most of my lens is through that. But New Zealand now has a reputation. It certainly didn't then. So I think that's definitely different. And I think some of the costs of trying stuff out, building websites, all of those things have come down so you can experiment. Now, most categories are more crowded, so you do have more competition, but sort of the price of trying stuff is a lot cheaper. So I do think that's changed.
Yeah, I can imagine. And even the availability of just trying to learn things and find out, right? Seems like the internet now is just so much more full of accessible information on almost a how-to on anything, not to mention LLMs that you can tap into now to learn stuff even faster. Yeah, it's been really exciting. And as I mentioned earlier in the interview, there is a massive amount of growth ahead for the tech sector. We're going to dig into this a little bit deeper during the interview as well, but just off the top of your head, what do you think the biggest challenges facing New Zealand tech are in this coming decade?
That's a great question. So I think if you think about the last 10 years, where, as you implied, we've had about 16% compound annual growth in the SaaS sector, or the cloud software sector. We've done a really good job of creating capital efficient, vertically focused companies that grow slow and steady and essentially leverage compound interest or monthly growth. The world's accelerated largely courtesy of AI. So I do think it's going to become a bit more furious on winning segments of the market. So I think that's probably the hardest thing. I think the blueprint, we've essentially, New Zealand software companies have largely leveraged the investments of Amazon and Microsoft, and to some extent Google, built stuff on the cloud infrastructure. So I think AI is going to be similar blueprint. So we're going to leverage the open AIs or the Anthropics or the core infrastructure. So I don't think it's that different, but I think it's how furious the pace is going to be. Slow and steady is probably not going to work. So I think the two consequences of that are New Zealand companies are going to have to be designed for growing really, really fast in a way they haven't had to in the sort of B2B SaaS era because of the AI dynamic. And I think the other is we have to sort of stop selling our companies when they get to 100 people, 10 million in revenue, or whatever the threshold is. And when we normally sell them, we're going to have to create a couple of national champions every year from here on in, because that formula is not going to keep working. We're not going to keep delivering.
Yeah, great points. And I'll touch on a couple of things that you've raised. The first is just around growing quickly. I know you're involved with a bunch of companies. Kogo comes to mind as one that's growing really quickly amongst several others. What are some of the consistent recurring challenges that you've seen occurring with companies that are trying to grow fast? Because there's obviously this big hiring component, there's an organizational systematic change that needs to take place. What does that look like, and where do startups often get tripped up?
Yeah, well, the things that help you grow to start with aren't the things that help you grow later. And so, and particularly in the world you operate, which is, digital marketing, the Google paid ads, all of that stuff. And so I think if most companies, when they've grown really well, when they look back, it was some experiment they did 3 years ago that happened to pay off. And so that experimental mindset is the most important thing to get right. To start early in your journey doing that, so running 3 or 4 experiments a month and reviewing those and keep measuring them. And if you can build that into the culture of your organization, then you can sort of break through that accelerating growth. And I think it's just different companies that have relied on 1 or 2 sort of predictable revenue models, typically based on paid search and SEO and stuff like that, they often get to a certain scale and then get stuck and don't have the muscle memory or the DNA to continue with their experimentation mindset. So I think that's probably the most important factor in companies that successfully grow and get liftoff.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I definitely think that your point around what works to grow you now won't be what works to grow you in 2 years. And everything has some sense of ceiling, right? And unless you can continue to expand the market that you're running an experiment in, or the opportunity, then all things are going to be, have a ceiling that restricts that growth in some ways. And one of the big things that I think SaaS companies in particular across the board really underlook at is brand, because I think that initially brand isn't so important, but as you do become one of those more dominant players in the market, then often it's the brand marketing component that really does push you forward. And I think that can be a scary jump to take, just in terms of linking up that attribution and moving away from, yes, that experiment definitely worked and here's the exact evidence, versus it did work, but we're running a range of things here and we're seeing total marketing investment grow, and the company growing alongside it. So I think that's like one of the potential challenges that I've seen. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, as you're saying, brand is a little bit hard to quantify month by month. So there's the investments that directly get you customers, and there's the investments that will get you future customers. And they're as important as each other. The payoff rates and timing is different. And I do agree with you. I think New Zealand companies, by and large, don't invest in sort of the brand, the customer experience, the resonance of their messaging anywhere near as much as they could. For a variety of reasons. Part of it, again, is investment profile. They typically don't have excess cash because they're capital efficient. And of course, if you don't have excess cash, you put it into Google AdWords. You don't put it into, some event series that drips over a year for which you don't actually know what the payback's going to be. So I do think that's a common challenge for New Zealand companies. It relates to the funding and capital efficiency requirements, but also the maturity of our industry. And so people who've been there, done that, will come back with that lens. And if you look at the companies that are really successful at some scale, take Xero, for example, they've done a great job of community building with accountants, creating XeroCon into sort of a biblical event of sorts, and obviously standing for a really crisp message, which is they made accounting software beautiful, and they really stood for something when they came to market. Many companies have a functional value, but don't really stand for anything. And again, that has long-term consequences.
Yeah, exactly. And it all kind of comes back to those stages, right? Obviously, when you're small, you have an idea of an MVP in the market, a few people, probably not much cash, and you need to kind of get you through to that next stage, working through, seed to Series A and so on. Do you have any insight as to like what the common challenges that a seed company will encounter, or a Series A company will encounter? Because what has been really interesting now, I've been in this industry myself for coming up to 5 years, is that you see a lot of seed companies that have raised a seed round that are getting really good early traction, and you kind of think, this is going to last forever, and then they'll hit Series A and seem to encounter another series of challenges. What do you think are some of those roadblocks at each stage of the capital raising cycle?
Yeah, so in my experience, in terms of the constraints or challenges for a seed company versus Series A company, I think in the context of a seed company, I'd say two things. One is understanding your ideal customer profile is typically the biggest challenge. The companies that are very lucid on who their ideal customer is have a much higher likelihood of being successful. That is almost universally the problem. Now, once they've solved that problem, typically traditional digital marketing campaigns and methods are successful for them. But as you know, there's a ceiling for those, and that typically happens at the Series A. And the problem is you've forgotten how to do experiments, because you had identified your ideal customer profile, you put some money on Google AdWords or whatever, or LinkedIn or whatever it happened to be, and then you ran across the ceiling and you've forgotten how to run experiments, and you weren't thinking about what happens when we hit the ceiling. What are the 2 or 3 things, arrows that we're going to have in the quiver to be able to leverage once we hit that ceiling? And so they come to a sudden stop. And the challenge is you're being successful. So when someone like me might go, hey, when the juice runs out of this particular phase, what are we going to do? It's like, no, there's so many customers, the world's so big, we'll never run out. And invariably it does happen. So again, I think the solution is continuous experimental mindset and having 2 or 3 things in your pocket of experiments you've run that give you some level of confidence that they can help you scale further once you get stuck in the traditional methods or the things that have worked for you at a seed stage.
Yeah, nice, brilliant. It sounds like it often comes back, as you have touched on, the experimental mindset, and not always, but often, particularly as the company begins to grow and you need to do things at bigger scale, those experiments also cost money as well. So why don't we talk a little bit about venture capital and raising money? You touched on how hard it was to raise capital when you were running your own startup. Do you want to talk about what the venture capital market and angel investor market looks like these days in New Zealand?
Yeah, I mean, happy to talk about the investor market as I see it. Look, I think let's start at the top end, if you like. I think New Zealand has a good reputation for building capital efficient verticalized SaaS companies. So you're in that space, and I'm involved in a couple of those, the likes of Released and Tradeify. Those companies are able to attract high quality capital from overseas markets. So I don't think they have particular challenges. If you sort of talk about Series A style investments, I'm involved in Movac, as you mentioned. New Zealand has a couple of the Australians, obviously a couple of homegrown ones like Movac and GD1. Enough capital in the market for sort of the Series A's of companies that have kind of broken through the seed stage. I think it's at the seed, pre-seed area where there's just insufficient capital. And particularly right now, the New Zealand economy is not in great shape necessarily, but actually the tech sector is just fine. And if you think about the survey that we did at the Southern SaaS conference, 92 or 93% of SaaS companies are optimistic about their growth prospects for 2024. So the sector's just fine, but the amount of people who are willing to put money in is reduced. And that's made harder by the fact that, our KiwiSaver and sort of some of the other funds just don't participate in that part of the market. So there is a little bit of challenge there. And it is at odds with the rest of the world to some extent. If you look at the valuations and propensity for seed rounds in the US, for example, in the last 2 years, there's been no change whatsoever to the money available at seed stage, both in terms of the amount of money and the valuation. So they've held up really, really well elsewhere because when times are tough, it's the best time to invest in new ventures. So that dynamic's just simply not here. I don't really know how to solve it. I wish more partners and accounting firms and law firms were investing in software startups or funds that support those. I wish more of the exited founders were putting more of their cash to work in the next generation of founders. So the ways of solving it are kind of obvious, but I don't know how to make that happen.
Yeah, it's always going to be a big challenge at any stage, right? It's all capital raising is interrelated to the market dynamics, what's happening overseas, and then also, I guess, the opportunity cost of investing into New Zealand versus investing into other markets as well. How do you think startups can try to think about themselves more on a global scale so that they can attract that international capital that you touched on, that Released and Tradeify can get?
Well, I think you've got to be, in order to attract international capital, you've got to be global from day one in terms of your proposition. Like if you've got a .nz on your URL, it's a pretty strong indicator. You haven't really thought at all about it. And that still happens today. I don't know why. So yeah, your proposition's got to be global from day one. You've got to use language and problem statements that are universally applicable, not just in the domestic market. And then you've got to be super laser focused on your ideal customer. Who are you solving the problem for? And again, one of the challenges in New Zealand is our domestic market's so small that we typically say, we solve this for plumbers and electricians and scaffolding people and installation guys and all of that stuff and the other. Not narrow enough for a global market. And MCom, the business I was part of, we had that problem. We're a mobile payments, mobile billing, mobile banking, mobile alerting platform. That's why we're called MCom, mobile commerce. Well, it was only when we decided to focus on the mobile banking market, and focus exclusively on retail banking, that we actually got some cut through internationally. So there's a lot to be said for real focus, narrow focus with a global market in mind.
Yeah, and that's such a good insight, and it's made me realize how I kind of see that recurring pattern as well with a lot of the startups that we work with, in terms of they'll, early stage startups that are looking to generate traction through channels to acquire customers. There's a big difference between those who are just targeting a number of different potential customers within a vertical versus a really niche company that just does X for Y, and the traction that they can get is very consistently leans towards that niche.
So the question is, when should you broaden from a very narrow ideal customer profile?
Yes.
My view is, if you're under 10 million in revenue, don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Because any market is bigger than 10 million in revenue. Like left-handed people called Jeff who own clothing stores is more than a $10 million a year market. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just, when you think globally, the smallest of segments are just enormous businesses. We see it in the exit. So, you take Sequent in Christchurch, they sold for $1.4 billion or whatever it was. Well, they do underwater or underground 3D modeling for mining companies. And you sort of think, oh, mining companies, how many of them can there be? How many of those want to do modeling? How much are they prepared to pay? Well, it turns out that having a very small fraction of that segment was worth, $1.4 billion to Bentley Systems. So they stayed niche and narrow for a very long time and still had a pretty good exit.
Yeah, great point, and really well said. And I think hopefully someone will be watching this interview and they'll have a startup, and maybe it's doing 10,000 of monthly recurring revenue. They're off to a good start just on their own bootstrapping. They might not know many people in the sector, or they might not know where to get started with raising capital. How should they just take that very first step in terms of raising capital, and when should they think about it?
My generic advice on raising capital to early stage founders is make a list, like physically make a list of the 20 people in the world who are best qualified to understand your market opportunity. So if you make software for scaffolding companies to organize their scaffolding setups, right? There's only a certain number of people who actually understand that market opportunity. I'm not one of them, and I'm going to guess you're not one of them either, Ryan. But someone who has owned a scaffolding company would, someone who's paid a lot of money for scaffolders to come in and install some scaffolding might. And so your starting point should always be the 20 people who are best placed to understand your market opportunity. If they all say no, it'll be for a reason. If some of them say yes, then you've got the best kind of investors, because they can verify or validate that there's a market opportunity. So, one of the companies I'm involved with, Montu, they do actuarial automation software. So we automate the parts of the job that actuaries don't want to do through AI, predictably. I know nothing about actuarial work, but I knew going in that Charles Hett, who was chief actuary at Deloitte, was investing in the company. That was pretty strong validation. There was a market opportunity. Now I know how to sell financial services companies and all of that stuff, but I know nothing about actuarial work. But Charles was probably the best person in New Zealand to invest in that company, because he could tell you the ins and outs of the opportunity that Montu was trying to address. And so that's my advice to founders.
Nice. That's fantastic advice. And just taking a step back to the wider tech sector again, coming back to that growth, and I think that growth for many of us is kind of the North Star of the tech sector over the next 10 years. I believe it was at Southern SaaS that I saw a metric. There's about 16,000 jobs in the tech sector right now. That's going to be about 66,000 jobs in about 2030 to 2032. That will add 50-odd thousand jobs to the sector. And, we've all heard the words brain drain that's occurring across New Zealand. It seems to be occurring all the time, and we're, losing talent by the day, by the sounds of it. How are we going to actually attract and retain people to build and lead our next generation of tech companies? That's an astounding amount of jobs that we're going to need to add.
Yes, I think there's two questions to be considered. One is, where do we find 50,000 additional cloud software professionals for the SaaS sector? And then the other is, how do we find the next generation of founders? And I think they're slightly different questions. So if we talk about next generation of founders, I think it's just a storytelling problem. So it's just people see other people doing it, and then they go, oh, maybe I could be one of those. So the best and most important thing we can do, or there's two of them really. One is tell stories in the media about the kind of companies that you and I support, which are totally underplayed, right? There's 10 times more stories about the water plumbing in Wellington in the newspapers than there are about going global tech companies. That's a real shame, a lost opportunity, really. So we've got to get good at storytelling in the public media, and then we've got to do it in private. We've got to send our young professionals, people like you and maybe me, I'm less young, but to the schools and say, here's what I do for a living, here's how much I get paid, here's the career trajectory I've had. That's all available to you if you're smart and hardworking and focused and good to work with. And so, to me, the next generation of founders is going to be solved through storytelling in public and private domains. In terms of the 50,000 people incrementally in the sector, I think that's a much more complicated issue. We need to create training courses. You've got the likes of Dev Academy, for example, in Wellington, doing a really good job, but certainly not producing anywhere near the number of people. So, there's going to be some modifications to how training is done. There's going to be more and more online resources. Thankfully, that's happening in its own right. The universities are going to adapt to how they teach, so that's not happening. And then I think companies themselves need to get better at sort of intern and graduate programs and that sort of thing. Is the raw talent around? Absolutely. There are lots of capable people out there. Many of those are currently working in the private sector, sort of more traditional, the sort of consulting firms and maybe government. So we need to figure out a way to reach those people and excite them about the prospects. And then we've got to get our training models right. I'm not worried about the number of people. I am worried about the training and onboarding models. And I don't think I think the sector is not doing enough to make that happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of this growth won't, as you're touching on, won't just come from, just new graduates or the youngsters coming up looking to where to start their career, but by a mix of both AI, potentially displacing a lot of jobs over the next several years. And then secondly, how lucrative actually working in tech can be for individuals. A lot of people might be needing to actually transfer over some of their skills and change the trajectories of their careers, and they're going to require a certain amount of training as well, right?
Exactly. So yes, there will be a lot of displacement on the back of AI and just macroeconomic stuff. So the best thing that, my sister's quite a lot smarter than me. She's a lawyer. Best thing that could happen is no one needs lawyers anymore, and because we're using AI or similar things, and she goes and does something useful and globally minded companies and put her skills to use in that way. So I'm not wishing her badly, but there's lots of people like that with really great brains and human skills and international exposure and context who are currently being used in what I'd consider low productivity sectors, and certainly not internationally minded export sectors.
Yeah, for sure. And I think AI is scary. It all seems to be happening pretty quickly. It's funny when you really look at it, because the concept of AI and the studies into AI have been happening for 50 plus years, but it seems like it's all of a sudden become something that's right in everyone's faces, and it is going to disrupt everything. It's safe to say that. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for New Zealand tech? And more importantly, how do you think we can keep up or get ahead of advancements in AI?
Yeah, great question. In terms of AI, I think it's a great thing for New Zealand tech, because I think it lowers the price of everything. Lowers the price of writing a business plan, it lowers the price of getting legal advice, it lowers the price of understanding the tax consequences of entering Canada, or whatever it happens to be. And so capital efficient all-rounders, which is how I describe the average New Zealand founder, would actually do better proportionally. So I think overall it's a good thing. And again, the mental model of building AI applications on top of these global champions, whether they be Microsoft or Amazon or whoever, is already a model we've proven with the B2B vertical SaaS scenario. So I think generally speaking, AI is useful. And then New Zealand founders, or New Zealanders generally, have a much more experimental mindset. So I think trying stuff out, even though New Zealanders are afraid of AI more so than, say, our American counterparts, if you look at the data from Ipsos. But nonetheless, New Zealanders are happy tinkerers. And AI, in my view, is actually a tinkering domain. You play around with stuff and figure out how it all works. And I think we'll do well out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I totally agree. It is a really big opportunity for New Zealand, especially when we're talking about challenges of jobs and those types of things. With increased efficiency, also reduces the pressure on how many people we do need. It makes everyone more productive. So there's definitely some great things to come off the back of that. One of the things you said was the word non-productive, which I really want to talk about. So tech is a highly productive sector in New Zealand, and as we know from this interview, it's growing super fast. I think SaaS itself is about just under 4 billion, and it'll grow to over 10 billion by 2030. Why is that growth so important to New Zealand? Can you help us understand how the productivity of a sector can have such a larger effect on the country's well-being and outcomes than other sectors that we lean on quite a lot?
Yeah, so in terms of productivity, I mean, productivity is crudely measured by, GDP output per capita. And so New Zealand's, so it's crude measure. I do take it with a grain of salt, but New Zealand's been declining proportionally for a long time for a variety of reasons. Some of those structural, like we don't have much competition. There's only one airport in New Zealand. There's, only one airline in New Zealand. We've got, oligopoly of power companies and so on. So there's limited competition in certain sectors. So that's one factor. The other is our tax structure. So, obviously residential property, investment dollars disproportionately go to the residential property market. That's not true in many other countries, or certainly nowhere to the extent to which it is. So, so that's kind of a problem. I mean, Judith Collins reminded me, who's now a Minister for Digital, and so if you think about the SaaS sector, really our representative minister, that in the 80s, New Zealand used to give economic development aid to Singapore. Right, so Singapore was so impoverished and unproductive that we used to help them with programs to build libraries and things like that. And of course, they're now much more productive as an island state than New Zealand is, and that just shows how far we've gone down and how fast they've gone up because they've focused on productivity and been very, very deliberate about that. Now it all feels academic, except that we've got to pay for hospitals and schools and roads and water pipes and whatever else. And so you need income to do that. It's just that simple. There's a lot of people out there who think these things happen by magic. But, in order to build the infrastructure have the style of living that we want will require money. That money only comes about through taxing. And you can only tax individuals or companies. And so we need both individuals and companies to be productive. So they pay lots of tax. So we have hospitals that save people's lives. That's just that simple. And again, all our trends have been going in the wrong direction for, I said, some structural reasons and some cultural ones.
So you touched on a great fact about the growth in Singapore and just how quickly and efficiently they've been able to grow their GDP relative to New Zealand. And it really leads me to thinking about the role that government and non-profit organizations play in helping the tech sector to improve. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so one of the things I love about the tech sector is it's not an exclusive club. If I want to be a surgeon, I need to go through 9 years of training and then be let into the Australasian College of Surgeons and then all these kind of processes, and then I've got to pay my fees, and then they can kick me out, and then I can't offer certain services unless I'm licensed to do so, right? all of these high value industries are actually licensed, and the supply is controlled. The tech is nothing like that. Anyone with a computer, internet connected computer, the one I'm talking to you on, it cost me $400, can actually stand up a service of some sort that's valuable to someone. And so the barriers to entry are very, very low comparative to the incomes they produce. It's unlike everything else. So if you're an actuary, a lawyer, a surgeon, the barriers to entry are very high. The cost to get there is hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you can't control whether you get in. Tech is nothing like that. So by design, it has none of the constraints and barriers to get in. I think the problem remains one of exposure and storytelling. Most people out there, most teenagers, have no idea what the tech sector is, how much it pays, that they could get into it straight after school or during school if they wanted to. The kind of roles that exist, you can be into the product design or user experience design. You don't just have to be a coder. You can be a mathematical person who loves data. There's so many roles. And so we as a sector have not done a good job of communicating that with kids or young people. We have not done a good job of communicating that with the careers advisors and the tech professionals and the digital tech professionals. So we've got a kind of communication job there directly with those stakeholders. And then we've got an indirect communication opportunity with the media to tell these stories, these amazing companies that are doing great things. New Zealand has over 1,000 exporting software companies. That's crazy. You have to imagine some of them have interesting stories to tell, but they're not being told.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many companies I can think of off the top of my head that do really, almost random, but it's like types of things that you wouldn't think about. But they're really exciting and they're doing really well at a global level. And often you've just never heard of them in New Zealand because they're so deep into their own vertical at a global level. It doesn't necessarily cross you by day. One of the big things I think that contributes to the wider sort of SaaS and startup ecosystem is the recycling of founders back into the ecosystem after a successful exit. You would be one example, but companies like Xero, co-founded by the likes of Philip Furlinger, come to mind, who then goes on to found Upstock, and so the cycle continues. What sort of role do you think that founder recycling plays within the ecosystem to the growth of the tech sector?
Yeah, I think the founder recycling question is an incredibly important one. Now, obviously, I can't tell any founder what to do once they've sold, bought themselves a holiday house, taken a few months off to ride bicycles or play golf or whatever they do. But, there's a role for them as an investor. There's a role for them as an advisor. There's obviously a role for them as a operator of some sort. I think it's really, really important to recycle that talent. And I think New Zealand does quite a good job of it, but we could do better. And it is really the only way to accelerate the learning cycles, because me helping someone who's doing something similar to what I did 15 years ago is just purely an accelerant of knowledge, let alone the capital question. So yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial. We're doing okay, but nowhere near as well as we could. And I'm personally really committed to it because I was fortunate, and the experience I had at MCom, I'm really passionate about increasing or improving the productivity of New Zealand, and I think tech is our best bet to do so. And so I'm pretty committed to helping out in whatever ways I can.
Nice. Yeah, it's I'm not in that position myself, obviously, but it must be an interesting thing to think about your future after a big exit in tech, and no doubt people probably take some time off and then hopefully re-enter the market to scratch another itch of a customer problem they found, or at least to put their capital to work as well. Some of the things we've talked about, you've touched on today, is just the quality of some of the companies in New Zealand. With that in mind, what are some of the founders that you admire right now and why?
In terms of the founders I admire, in some ways I admire all the founders for having the courage to go and give something a go, knowing that the highest probability outcome is failure. And that certainly was what happened to me first time around. So, there's an element to which I admire all founders. I'm not going to mention the companies I'm directly involved with, just so I don't want to play favorites. But if I think about some of the people who I watch from afar who are really impressive, the underlying reason they are impressive is they're just so clear on what they want to achieve in the world, and how the world will be different when they're done with it. It doesn't mean they're mission do good type propositions, but they're just so lucid about who they're going to solve what problem for. And so a good example of that is Luke Campbell at VXT. They're sort of, integrating sort of recorded phone conversations, a problem you think would have been solved long ago but hasn't. Amber Joseph at Nextwork, creating online training that has impact. Grant Johnson at Rocket Spark, they do websites for small businesses through designers. Sort of different businesses at different stages, but the thing that ties them all together is just the clarity of purpose. And I guess some advice for founders out there who are considering is, the clearer you are on the good you want to do in the world, the easier your journey will be, and that's what makes me admire them.
Nice, that's a brilliant answer. There's so many founders out there at the moment that just have so much grit and resilience. As you said, it takes guts to just get out there and start something. And much earlier in the interview, you touched on how valuable failure is as a teacher as well. So I guess no matter what happens to any startup, where there's founders founded by companies, founded by people, they're likely to come out either with a successful company or with an invaluable lesson that they can take on to the next. Just sort of looking at wrapping up this interview shortly, I wanted to ask one of my last question about the New Zealand startup scene before jumping into some quick fire questions. In your opinion, what's the zeitgeist in the New Zealand startup scene today?
Yeah, the zeitgeist of the New Zealand startup scene, well, firstly, it's very specific, I think, to verticalized SaaS or cloud productivity software, B2B. So there's kind of a narrowness there. And then the other is capital efficiency of it. So real focus on slow and steady, find your place in the world, and focus without spending too much money to go and win the space that you want to occupy. So it's not a very good cliched answer of the zeitgeist as such. It wouldn't make a very good poster, but that's how I see it.
And how do you think that needs to change over the next 10 years, or what do you think it might be over the next 10 years?
Focused niches underpinned by AI.
Nice. Just going to jump into some quick fire questions now, Serge. Number one, SaaS or deep
Sorry,
tech?
do I give you the reason why I give you the answer or not?
Yeah, I think give me the reason why you have the answer as well.
Okay. Go ahead.
Right, number one, quick fire questions, SaaS or deep tech?
SaaS all day long. It's not going to be about software. It's going to be service as a service in the next 10 years.
Nice. Capital raising or bootstrapping?
Bootstrapping is more fun.
Charlie Munger or Chamath Palihapitiya?
Charlie Munger all day long. Ethics first, human being.
And finally, New Zealand or Australia?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm leaning towards Australia. I just find some of our very dull rhetoric at the moment, all the identitarian bullshit that's going on, pretty toxic. And if I started my life again, I'd probably want to reincarnate in Australia right now. And it's not a feeling I enjoy, but especially because I'm a migrant. But it's one I have.
I think I totally agree. Think things will turn around. I am an internal optimist as well. But hey, thanks so much for your time today, Serge. It's been great chatting to you. Just before we finish off, is there anything that I haven't asked today that you'd love to talk about?
One moment, let me think about that.
Sure.
Yeah, I suppose, yes. In terms of other things, probably worth mentioning, I think the only one thing that's on my mind often is, especially in the cloud sector, is we're selling to different verticals and different geographies, different propositions. We have no natural point of unity. So if you're the Wine Growers Association or the Meat Producers Association or the Kiwi Fruit Growers Association, you all have a natural point of both community and influence, i.e. lobbying. And so I think there's this kind of part of my mission, and what I'm trying to do is turn the software sector, despite all those differences in target markets and propositions, into some form of community that is both enjoyable to be part of, as well as have influence in government policy, which includes some of the things we've talked about. How do we influence the educational curriculum? How do we influence, educational models? How do we influence funding of various things? And so, we have to figure out as a sector, without creating layers of bureaucracy and political structures, how we work as a sector or an industry.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Thanks for your time as well, Serge. It's been great chatting to you and looking forward to continuing the conversation in future.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.